My landlord entered my apartment while I was home, but I never heard the door open. I thought I was alone in my apartment, but the subtle changes I noticed proved someone had been watching my every move. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Harper, and I'm 24 years old. I moved into the Oakwood apartment 6 months ago, attracted by the reasonable rent and the charming older building with its high ceilings and original hardwood floors. At first, everything seemed perfect. My apartment, number 4B, faced away from the street, offering a peaceful view of the courtyard garden. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, appeared friendly enough during our initial interactions. A man in his late 50s with a perpetually nervous smile and hands that never seemed to stop moving. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening in early October. I had been working from home, as I often did as a freelance graphic designer. I was sitting at my desk in the living room, completely absorbed in a project, when I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sound or movement that caught my attention, but rather a shift in the atmosphere, like when someone walks into a room behind you and you sense their presence before you see them. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination and the stress of my looming deadline. I returned to my work, pushing the unsettling feeling aside. 2 days later, I noticed something odd. I had left a coffee mug on the end table by my sofa, positioned precisely at a right angle to the edge of the table. I remembered this detail because I have a mild obsession with symmetry and order. When I came home from running errands, the mug had been moved slightly, now at a slight diagonal. I lived alone, and I knew I hadn't touched it since that morning. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had bumped it without realizing. Maybe the building's vibrations had caused it to shift. But deep down, I knew these explanations were weak. The mug had been deliberately moved, and by someone other than me. The following week, I was taking a shower when I heard what I thought was my front door closing. I immediately turned off the water, wrapped myself in a towel, and stepped out of the bathroom. The apartment was silent. I checked the door, still locked from the inside. I walked through every room, looking for any sign of an intruder. Nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had just been there. That night, I mentioned these strange occurrences to my best friend over the phone. She suggested I might be working too much and seeing things that weren't there. I wanted to believe she was right. I didn't want to admit that the alternative, that someone was entering my apartment without my knowledge, was far more terrifying. The weekend came, and I decided to spend Saturday morning organizing my bedroom closet. As I was folding clothes, I noticed that the pair of shoes I had worn the previous day wasn't where I had left them, by the door. Instead, they were neatly placed side by side under my bedroom window. I never put my shoes there. My heart started racing as I scanned the room for other signs that someone had been in my personal space. That's when I noticed the window latch. It was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it before leaving the apartment the day before. The building was 3 stories up, making entry through the window highly unlikely unless someone had a very tall ladder. But more importantly, the window hadn't been forced open. Someone with a key or knowledge of how to bypass the lock had come in while I was away. As I stood there examining the window, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They stopped at my door. I held my breath, listening. There was a soft jingle of keys, then the sound of the lock turning. My blood ran cold. I was home, and someone was about to enter my apartment with a key. I froze in my bedroom, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps in the hallway moved away from my door without entering. I waited several minutes before daring to move, my muscles tense and ready to flee or fight. When I finally crept to my front door and looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. But there, on the floor just outside my door, was a small maintenance request form, the kind Mr. Peterson used when tenants reported issues. I didn't submit any maintenance request. I hadn't spoken to Mr. Peterson in weeks. Why would he be trying to enter my apartment with a key? And why did he leave when he must have realized I was home? These questions swirled in my mind as I locked the deadbolt and slid the security chain into place, though I knew these measures were useless against someone who possessed a master key. The next day, I went to the building management office to speak with Mr. Peterson directly. I wanted to ask him about the maintenance form and whether he had tried to enter my apartment. But when I arrived, the office was closed, with a handwritten sign indicating Mr. Peterson was out of town until the following week. This struck me as odd. If he was out of town, who had been at my door the previous day? Who had the keys to my apartment? The building manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, handled most day-to-day operations, but she was in her 70s and rarely worked weekends. I was becoming increasingly convinced that someone had unrestricted access to my apartment and was using it when I least expected. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I started taking photos of my apartment before leaving for errands, then comparing them when I returned. At first, I found nothing out of place, and I began to wonder if I was indeed overreacting. But then, the evidence became undeniable. One evening, I came home to find that the books on my living room shelf had been rearranged. I'm particular about how I organize my books, by author, then alphabetically by title. But someone had pulled out several books and placed them back in random order. At first glance, the change might seem insignificant, but to me, it was a clear violation of my space. The next day, I noticed that the decorative pillows on my bed, which I always arrange in a specific pattern, had been fluffed and positioned differently. Again, a small detail that most people wouldn't notice, but one that confirmed my suspicions. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked and a heavy dresser pushed against it. I purchased a small security camera that I positioned to face my front door, though I worried about the legality of recording in my own apartment. Every creak of the building, every sound from neighboring apartments put me on high alert. I was becoming paranoid, but with good reason. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. I had fallen asleep on the sofa while watching a movie, fully intending to move to my bedroom later. When I woke up around 2 a.m., I discovered that someone had covered me with a blanket from my bed. The blanket hadn't been there when I dozed off. I checked my apartment, doors locked, windows secure, but someone had been inside while I slept, close enough to touch me, and I had never waken up. The next morning, I went to the local electronics store and bought several more security cameras. I also purchased motion sensors for my windows and doors. I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. I was going to find out who was entering my apartment, and I was going to stop them. As I set up the cameras in strategic locations throughout my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind me. When I finished installing the last camera in my bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my dresser, next to the jewelry box where I kept my most valuable pieces, was a single white rose. I had never seen it before, and I certainly hadn't put it there. The white rose on my dresser sent chills down my spine. It was fresh, with dew still clinging to the petals, which meant someone had placed it there very recently. I carefully picked it up with a tissue, avoiding touching it directly, and placed it in a plastic bag. I didn't know if I would need it as evidence, but I wanted to preserve it just in case. That weekend, I devoted myself to transforming my apartment into a surveillance fortress. I installed cameras with night vision in every room, each connected to a secure cloud storage system that I could access from my phone. I placed motion sensors on all windows and doors, including the interior doors of my bedroom and bathroom. I even bought a small device that would alert me to any sound above a certain decibel while I was asleep. On Monday, I contacted a tenant rights organization to learn more about my legal options. I learned that in my state, landlords were required to provide at least 24 hours notice before entering an apartment, except in cases of emergency. Any unauthorized entry could be considered a violation of privacy and potentially illegal.
Armed with this information, I drafted a formal letter to Mr. Peterson, citing my concerns and requesting that no one enter my apartment without my explicit permission and proper notice. I printed 2 copies of the letter, one to mail to Mr. Peterson's office and one to deliver in person. When I went to the management office,
I was surprised to find Mrs. Rodriguez there instead of Mr. Peterson. She seemed flustered when I asked about his whereabouts, claiming he was dealing with a family emergency and would be back later in the week. I left the letter with her, asking her to place it on his desk immediately. That night, as I reviewed the footage from my cameras, I noticed something strange. Around 3 a.m., there was a brief flicker in the camera feed from my living room, lasting only a few seconds. When the feed stabilized, nothing appeared to have changed, but the timestamp indicated a gap of approximately 30 seconds. The same thing happened in the footage from my bedroom camera at roughly the same time. I replayed the segments multiple times, trying to understand what had caused the interruption. It wasn't a technical malfunction, at least not one I could identify. The cameras were brand new and had been working perfectly all day. The only explanation was that someone had found a way to disable them temporarily, enter my apartment, and then restore the feed before leaving. The next day, I bought a cheap, old-fashioned digital camera and set it up to record continuously, hidden among books on my shelf. I also placed a thin line of clear tape across the bottom of my front door, positioned in such a way that it would break if the door were opened. I was determined to catch my intruder, no matter how sophisticated their methods. That evening, I invited a friend over for dinner, partly for company and partly to have a witness to my increasingly bizarre situation. As we were eating, the motion sensor on my front door chimed, indicating movement in the hallway outside. We both froze, listening. There was the sound of keys jingling, then the distinct click of the lock turning. My friend grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. I put a finger to my lips, signaling her to be quiet as I pulled out my phone to check the camera feeds. To my astonishment, the cameras showed no one at my door. Yet we could both hear the unmistakable sound of someone trying to enter. The doorknob turned slowly, but the security chain held fast. Whoever was outside seemed to realize this, as the attempts stopped abruptly. We heard footsteps retreating down the hall, then the sound of the building's main entrance door closing. When we checked the door, we found the security chain intact, but the tape I had placed at the bottom of the door was broken. Someone had managed to open the door just enough to break the tape without triggering the security chain. The digital camera I had hidden on the shelf had captured nothing unusual. The footage showed my friend and I having dinner, with no indication that anyone had attempted to enter. The next morning, I discovered another white rose on my kitchen counter. This time, it came with a small note written in elegant cursive. "I know what you're doing." My blood ran cold as I realized that my intruder was not only aware of my surveillance efforts, but was actively mocking them. The discovery of the second white rose and the accompanying note sent me into a state of panic. Whoever was entering my apartment wasn't just a voyeur or a thief. They were toying with me, enjoying my fear and confusion. I called the police to report the break-ins, but when they arrived, they seemed dismissive of my concerns. Without signs of forced entry or missing property, there was little they could do. They suggested I change my locks and perhaps consider moving if I felt unsafe. Changing the locks seemed like a logical next step, but I knew it wouldn't solve the problem. My intruder had a master key, and even if I changed the locks, they could still enter unless the entire building's lock system was replaced, a costly measure that Mr. Peterson was unlikely to approve. Instead, I decided to change my routine. I began leaving at random times and returning unexpectedly, hoping to catch the intruder off guard. I also started staying up late, sometimes dozing in a chair with my phone in hand, ready to record any suspicious activity. On Wednesday night, my strategy paid off. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting in the dark in my living room when I heard the soft click of my front door unlocking. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The door opened slowly, silently, and a figure slipped inside. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the silhouette of a person of average height, moving with deliberate, practiced motions. They closed the door behind them, then stood perfectly still for a moment, as if listening for any sign that I was awake. I remained motionless, barely breathing, as I watched through the slits of my nearly closed eyes. The figure moved further into the apartment, heading toward my bedroom. As they passed the window, a sliver of moonlight illuminated their face just enough for me to recognize them. My blood ran cold when I realized who it was. Not Mr. Peterson, as I had suspected, but Mrs. Rodriguez, the building manager who had claimed Mr. Peterson was out of town. She disappeared into my bedroom, and I seized the opportunity to slip out of the apartment. I didn't stop running until I was outside the building, where I called the police from a safe distance. When they arrived, I explained what had happened and led them to my apartment. To my shock, when we entered, Mrs. Rodriguez was nowhere to be found. My apartment appeared undisturbed, with no sign that anyone had entered. The police searched the building but found no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The next day, I went to the management office to confront Mrs. Rodriguez. She was there, acting as if nothing had happened. When I accused her of entering my apartment the previous night, she denied it vehemently, claiming she had been home with her husband. She even produced an alibi, with her husband confirming her story. I was baffled. I knew what I had seen with my own eyes, but without evidence, my accusation was just my word against hers. The police had been reluctant to pursue the matter further, and now I was beginning to question my own sanity. Had I imagined it? Was the stress of the situation causing me to see things that weren't there? Determined to find proof, I reviewed all my camera footage from the previous night. To my frustration, there was no sign of Mrs. Rodriguez entering my apartment. The cameras showed nothing unusual, no interruptions in the feed, no mysterious gaps. It was as if no one had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't let it go. I decided to do some research on Mrs. Rodriguez, hoping to find some clue that might explain her behavior. What I discovered shocked me. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't who she claimed to be. The real Mrs. Rodriguez had retired and moved to Florida 2 years ago. The woman working in the management office was someone else entirely, an imposter who had somehow taken over the real Mrs. Rodriguez's identity. With this new information, I went to the police again. This time, they took me more seriously. They began investigating the woman I knew as Mrs. Rodriguez, and what they uncovered was more disturbing than I could have imagined. The police investigation revealed a web of deception that extended far beyond my apartment building. The woman posing as Mrs. Rodriguez was actually named Patricia Winters, a woman with a history of assuming false identities and manipulating rental properties for her own gain. She had targeted buildings with absentee landlords or lax management, gradually insinuating herself into positions of trust and authority. In the case of Oakwood Apartments, Patricia had befriended the real Mrs. Rodriguez before her retirement, learning the building's systems and routines. When the original manager left, Patricia simply stepped into her role, forging documents and creating a convincing backstory that fooled tenants and vendors alike. Mr. Peterson, the actual landlord, had been dealing with a serious illness and rarely visited the property, making it easy for Patricia to operate without scrutiny. But why had she been entering my apartment specifically? The police discovered that Patricia had a particular interest in Unit 4B, my apartment. It turned out that the previous tenant, a young woman named Ashley, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances about a year before I moved in. The police had investigated at the time but found no evidence of foul play, eventually classifying the case as a voluntary disappearance. Now, with Patricia's true identity revealed, the police reopened the investigation into Ashley's disappearance. They obtained a search warrant for Patricia's actual residence, where they found evidence that linked her to not only Ashley's case, but to several other similar disappearances in different cities. It appeared that Patricia had a pattern of targeting young women who lived alone, gaining access to their apartments under various pretenses, and then making them disappear. The white roses she left for me were her calling card, something she had left at each crime scene. The most chilling discovery came when the police searched a storage unit rented under one of Patricia's aliases. Inside, they found a meticulously documented record of her activities, including photographs and detailed notes about her victims. There was an entire section devoted to Ashley, and another section, alarmingly, devoted to me. The notes about me revealed that Patricia had been studying my routines for weeks, learning her schedule and habits. She had entered my apartment multiple times, moving objects, rearranging furniture, and even watching me while I slept. The purpose of these intrusions wasn't immediately clear, but the police theorized that Patricia was testing my awareness and reactions, gathering information for some unknown purpose. As the investigation continued, I was asked to identify various items found in Patricia's possession. Among them were several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to Ashley, as well as other personal items from her apartment. Patricia had been keeping these as trophies, mementos of her crimes. The police also discovered that Patricia had been planning something specific for me. In her notes, she referred to an event scheduled for the upcoming weekend, though she didn't specify what this event entailed. The cryptic nature of these references, combined with what the police had learned about Patricia's history, led them to believe she was planning to make me her next victim. With this information, the police set up a trap. They arranged for me to continue my normal routine, making it appear as though I was unaware of their investigation. Meanwhile, they placed officers in strategic positions throughout the building, ready to intervene the moment Patricia attempted to enter my apartment again. Friday night arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. The police had assured me that I would be safe, but knowing that Patricia was planning something for me was terrifying. I went about my evening as usual, cooking dinner, watching television, and getting ready for bed. All the while, I knew that unseen eyes were watching, waiting for Patricia to make her move. Around midnight, as I was getting ready to turn in for the night, I heard the familiar sound of my front door unlocking. The police had given me a signal, a specific phrase to say over the phone if I detected Patricia's presence. With trembling hands, I dialed the designated number and whispered the code words, "The Eagle has landed." Within seconds of me uttering the code words, my apartment was flooded with police officers. They had been stationed in the hallway, in neighboring apartments, and even on the fire escape outside my window. Patricia, who had just entered my apartment, was taken completely by surprise. She didn't even have time to react before she was handcuffed and escorted out of the building. The subsequent investigation revealed the full extent of Patricia's crimes. She confessed to not only causing Ashley's disappearance, but to 5 other similar cases across 3 different states. The white roses she left were indeed her calling card, a symbol of the purity she claimed to be restoring by removing what she considered undesirable elements from society. In her confession, Patricia explained that she had been targeting young women who lived alone because she saw them as vulnerable and isolated. She would gain access to their apartments, study their habits, and eventually orchestrate their disappearances, making it look as though they had simply moved away without telling anyone. In my case, Patricia had been preparing to act the following weekend when she knew I would be alone in the apartment. She had planned to drug me and transport me to an undisclosed location where she would decide whether to keep me or dispose of me depending on how well I complied with her demands. The discovery of Patricia's activities sent shockwaves through the community. Other tenants came forward with their own stories of suspicious occurrences, and the building's management came under scrutiny. Mr. Peterson, the landlord, was devastated to learn what had been happening under his nose. He immediately implemented new security measures, including changing all the locks and installing a comprehensive surveillance system throughout the building. In the aftermath of Patricia's arrest, I had to make a decision about whether to stay in my apartment or move elsewhere. Part of me wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and the place where I had been so thoroughly violated. But another part of me felt a strange sense of attachment to the home I had worked hard to create. In the end, I decided to stay, but with new security measures of my own. I kept the cameras I had installed, added more sophisticated locks, and even got a large dog who served as both companion and protector. I also became an advocate for tenant rights, working with local organizations to raise awareness about landlord responsibilities and tenant protections. The experience changed me in profound ways. I became more vigilant, less trusting, and more aware of my surroundings. But I also discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed, the ability to face my fears head-on and take action to protect myself. As for Patricia, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her lack of remorse shocked even the most seasoned detectives. During her trial, she showed no emotion, even when confronted with the heartbreaking testimonies of the families of her victims. The mystery of Ashley's disappearance was finally solved when Patricia led investigators to a remote cabin in the mountains where Ashley's remains were discovered buried in the woods. Though the outcome was tragic, at least her family finally had closure and could lay their daughter to rest. A year has passed since these events, and I still live in the same apartment. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I find myself listening for the sound of someone trying to enter, my heart racing until I remind myself that Patricia is behind bars and can no longer harm me. The white roses no longer appear mysteriously in my apartment, and I no longer wake up to find my belongings rearranged. But the memory of those terrifying months will always stay with me, a reminder of how quickly our sense of security can be shattered and how important it is to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. I've learned to be more careful, more observant, and more proactive about my safety. But I've also learned not to let fear control my life. I continue to work as a freelance graphic designer, enjoy my home, and live my life on my own terms, just with a little more awareness and a lot more security than before. The experience has made me stronger, more resilient, and more appreciative of the simple feeling of safety in my own home. It's a feeling I once took for granted, but now cherish every single day.